Hi, my name is Brandi Losh with Art by Blush, and today I'm going to do a demonstration of a small painting on a 4x4 canvas in acrylic and gouache. So the first thing that we're going to do is prime our canvas, and what I use with that is usually just a flat brush. This one that I'm using today is just a 3/4 size because we're actually going to paint a miniature painting on just a little 4x4 canvas of a gnome. I use gesso to prime my canvas, but if you don't have gesso, you can always just use regular white acrylic paint. It actually works just as well. Here is an example of the gesso and the white acrylic paint that I use. I usually buy quite a bit of that in bulk because I use a lot of white, but I have found that the Liquitex gesso is a lot thicker, which I want kind of a thicker layer on there. So we're going to start by doing that, and you apply it in flat, even strokes, and it usually only takes about 15 to 20 minutes to dry on a small canvas. You want to make sure that it is completely dry before you start your sketch. And so now your sketch is ready. It took about 15-20 minutes for the gesso to dry, so not very long. And I went ahead and sketched out my gnome. Now I use anywhere from a graphite HB pencil to a 2H or 2B. Don't worry if your sketch is a little dark. You can always erase if you make a mistake. As you can see, I already did erase a little bit on the hat. And you're going to be covering all this with paint, so you're not going to be able to see your pencil lines whenever you're finished with the painting. But this one was really easy. We're going to paint a beekeeper gnome, and I just used basic shapes like circles and ovals to draw my little bees and my gnome. If you look at the hat, it's more like a triangle. So just real easy, not a lot of detail because you're going to paint the detail in when you start. The next thing is to pick your color palette. Now, I am always changing my mind while I'm painting something, but for now, obviously because of the bees, we're going to use some yellow and black. I put some blue and magenta out and some green for the grass, and just a little bit of the portrait pink, which I'll probably mix some burnt sienna in for his nose and hands. Also, since this is a smaller painting, we are just using some smaller brushes, various sizes, so just whatever brush you're comfortable with. I'm using a styrofoam plate for my palette because when I get done, I can just toss that in the trash. Okay, so I put out my black and my yellow colors and a little bit of the magenta to start, and I'm going to show you when you go to paint onto the gnome, you want to paint in the direction of the shape you're painting so it gives it depth and dimension. Okay, we're gonna start painting, and I forgot to mention to always have, I use 2 mason jars with clean water to rinse your brush in between each color. And some of it, when we get to the shading and highlighting part, we're actually gonna use water to rework our painting. So I'm gonna put a little bit magenta on my brush. And I think we're just going to start with his hat. And sometimes I use white to light my paint up a little bit, make it a little thicker, because I can always change the color once I get that first layer on. And really with acrylic painting, for me, it's just a layering process. Layer after layer so that your colors show through, and it kind of gives you that illusion of the shadows and the highlights. So what we're going to do is start on his hat here. If you get a little bit outside the lines, don't worry, there's no mistakes. You can always change it. And I'm going to fatten it up just a little bit. And we're going to use the magenta for his little hat. I gave him, you don't have to, you can leave it pointy on top, but I gave him a little extra hat at the top. So, I'm just going to do that. That is my first layer. I like to paint with pink because different shades of pink with green and blue and turquoise and teal, they're really happy colors and they're happy spring colors. So as you can see, I painted in the direction of the shape of his hat because that's going to give him dimension, and each layer that you do, you're going to do that on. And I apologize if my camera is a little bit shaky, but I'm trying to paint and film at the same time. So there's the first layer on the hat. So let me get a few more parts of this done, and then I'll be able to show you the next step. Before we move on to that, we'll go ahead and paint his little gnome robe, which I'm going to kind of paint that loose and flowy around his little feet. And I'm painting in the shape of that. So here I have got a lot of my first layer of paint on each object in the painting, and I want to show you where I do paint the sides. So I've got that a rough draft of grass. Doesn't have to be perfect because again it's your first layer, and I'm going to end up running the sky into it, but you can see that the painting does flow, especially with these little 4x4 and 6x6 canvases, because they have a wider side, so you can, do lettering, extend your painting all the way around, so it's got that really cool 3D effect. And I do show you here quickly, without sticking my hand in the paint, the top and even the bottom. So when it's hanging on the wall, you can see all that, and it gives it a nice cohesive look. So I'm going to, some people put the background in first, depending on how much detail I have in the background. I a lot of times do it last, because even if I get that over on my painting, on any of the objects in my painting, like I said, I can either work it into the painting or I can paint over it. I want to mention that what I mixed for the wings and his nose, and point out a few changes that I made when I was putting in that first layer. So we're almost done with the first layer for the sky. And you can see I got a little on his hat, but that's okay, because that's all going to work to our advantage later. So what I did was I mixed up a little of my yellow with white so that it gave the wings that light yellow look. And I used, as I'd mentioned, a portrait pink on his nose, which that's going to change when we detail it out. But for the honey pot, I did a yellow and burnt sienna with just a little bit of white, and it kind of looks gold. Actually, it's not a honey pot, beehive. And that's how I got that color. So I did go in and I made his beard wider, as I mentioned that I would probably do once I got in there and painting, because once I start painting, it changes throughout the painting. And I brought his beard down to between his feet. And then I broadened the hat and stuff a little bit. And then I'm going to have to paint back in my little hands, probably right in here holding the honey comb. So here I have applied a second layer of color to everything, and I've started some shading and highlights. So I want to show you, I put some white paint up on the hat, how I use water to work my paint back in and kind of make it like a highlight. So I'm going to take my brush and I put out a little bit of the lighter magenta. I'm going to get a little bit of that, just a little white. And I'm going to make sure my brush is wet, but not too wet. So I'm actually going to wipe it off on a paper towel. And then I'm just going to go in here and I'm going to start working with the water. As you can see, this is a little bit thinner on that white paint. And it was starting to dry, but if you make a mistake, you can actually use the water to rub it out sometimes. So I'm going to work that in there where I'm going to be adding the highlights and the lowlights. And I'm just kind of scratching the canvas with my brush. But I don't have it soaked, because if you do it soaked, it will start running, and it'll show up where it runs down your paint. So I've got that in there, and I want to make sure that I leave a little dark there for the outline. And then we'll take actually a little more of the dark, wet my brush again. So yes, I am putting paint on it, then wetting it, and then wiping it off. And I'm going to go in here with the dark and start working that around and blending that in. Just need a little bit more. And that'll start giving it a little bit of dimension. Now, as you can see, the dimension, of course, isn't finished. I did add nostrils onto him because I thought he was missing something there. And I took my portrait pink and added a little of the burnt sienna, and I did a little bit of an outline there and blended that in and gave him a little highlight. And I did the same with the hands and gave him little tiny thumbs. But I really thought he should be smiling, so I did put a little mouth on him because I thought it was really cute, but it's up to you. You can leave that off. And I'm going to work on the lowlights and highlights and then show you what it's going to look like. So I am going to add a little tiny bit of white in here, and then I'm going to wet my brush again. Make sure it's not soaking wet. Dry it on your paper towel. I'm going to go in here and start working in my highlights. So that is the next step, and that's where we are at in the painting. And here shortly I'll be able to show you more of a finished version. I don't use black for the shadows much. I use a lot of blue, dark blue and purple to give shadow, unless it's something that's really dark. Also, you can see that I added the yellow to the bees because I actually had forgot to put that in there the first time. I put another layer on my wings, so now you can't see the pencil marks. And they're about ready to be detailed out as well. So I'm going to go ahead and show you real quick how to do a little shading on the hat. So I have some highlighting. So I added some dark blue to the, that I'm going to mix just a little magenta into. And again, I'm going to dip my brush in the water. I'm going to make sure it's not sopping wet. And then I'm going to just put some shadows in here. So I am going to put a little shadow here, maybe over here, and on the bottom of his hat. Then I'm going to completely rinse my brush. I'm going to dry it off just a little bit. And then I'm going to use that water to rework the paint and mix it on my canvas to give that illusion of a shadow. Again, still painting in the direction of the shape. So if it's round, you kind of want to go in a round direction. If it's straight, you want to go straight, but just to give it that dimension. My brush got a little dry, so to wet that again, make sure it is not soaking wet. I'm going to use that water and just mix that in there like so. And I'll probably add a few more highlights when it's said and done. I mentioned the clouds in the photo and giving kind of the illusion of them. So what I do is start with a thick layer of white with just a tiny bit of that background color mixed in. And I'm gonna start outlining my painting, but as it dries, and this is how I add kind of a halo around the objects in my painting as well. But here, sorry again if my camera's a little shaky, you can fix it. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna let that start to kind of dry because I put a thick layer on there. And then I'm gonna start mixing in just the white to kind of give it that texture. But kind of going around, you see I'm going around in a circle with my brush strokes. We'll let that dry for a few minutes because it's better when it's a little bit tacky. We'll go ahead and up as fast as I can where it's just kind of a hint of the color, and I start painting that around my objects. So with the gnome, it'll be like a lighter color, and then I'll start mixing on the canvas around everything the darker color of the sky. And that technique where I use the brush with a little bit of water, I'm gonna do that. Rinse your brush really good. And again, you don't want it soaking wet. And I'm just gonna put white paint on my brush, and I'm gonna start working it in around him. As you can see there, he's gonna have a little bit of a halo. And then I'm gonna wet my brush again. And I'm just gonna use the water to work that in. Maybe need a little darker there in the middle to give it that contrast. Sorry, I didn't have it. And as you can see, when I push out with the camera, he has a halo started. Now for my final touch, I'm working on the grass. So I'm going to show you how to do that. And yes, I will be going all the way out to the sides with that. And I did add a little magenta into my white up here for my clouds. And I'm probably going to add one more layer of pure white up in here to kind of give that just a little bit more dimension. But as you can see, the bees and my little gnome are finished. I took a little bit of blue, dark blue, and dark green and mixed it together, wetted my brush and put a very thin layer to make a little shadow down here for him, just like the method that I've been showing you. So now we're working on the grass, and that's real easy. You just go in and wherever you want your grass and take a thin brush, small brush, and just paint it in there. I will be bringing this, as I said, out to the side, so it's a three-dimensional painting. Doesn't have to be perfect. I've just been using quick strokes and add a little more highlighting in there for them. A little more highlighting down here. I'm just kind of scratching that on there, as I mentioned, that I did with the shadow. And there you go. My last step in the painting process is sealing my painting. I use Krylon. You can use any brand. I like a gloss. It makes it nice and shiny. It's UV resistant. It keeps it from getting dirty, and it keeps the paint from fading. And then once you spray that on there, do thin, even layers. And I do recommend taking that outside because the fumes are really strong. But once you get that done, and you can put as many layers on there as you want, depending on how shiny you want it, it's ready for display. So you can hang it or set it on your table with these minis, and they're ready to go. Thank you so much for watching my video, and you can find this little guy and more of my paintings at Artistry on Main and Buchanan, and they are for sale. So you can run in and grab you one of the gnomes, or you can make one of your own. Thank you again, and have a great day.